Now, here's where I really give, and I have acknowledged this and thanked my friends subsequently, because they just allowed me to crash with them. They put me up, fed me, you know, I didn't pay any rent or anything for food and stuff. Because I had written my, you know, thesis in this holy book, I didn't actually go on talking about being the new prophet and so on. It was all in the book. I figured people could read it. So that was a thing that I think also helped me through this a little bit. But I was also really talking quite a bit. I was about religion, and I think my friends were in a similar kind of existential state in that they were all people who'd been raised or had without religion or had rejected religion and spirituality. And here I was, I think, talking about things that were kind of on the cusp of their consciousness. So we actually had many lively conversations during that time. That went on for about 2 months. And at the end of that time, with no medication, no formal medical, psychiatric, psychological treatment, I came back to earth. My feet were back on the ground. I was no longer thinking about being a reincarnation of Buddha and Christ and so on. Now, subsequently, there have been some other programs that have worked with first-break psychotic patients. In fact, a couple of them were in the San Francisco Bay Area, one called Diabasis, opened by a Jungian analyst named John Perry, and one in San Jose, opened by a psychiatrist named Lauren Mosier, called Soteria House. And they basically let people who were experiencing states similar to my own go through the experience with support in a kind of sanctuary environment where they were just, you know, their inner journey was facilitated. They were given art materials. They were allowed to, dance their inner journey or write about it or draw it or talk to people about it at all hours of the day and night. And what they found is that a very high percentage, 60 to 70% of these first break patients would go through that experience totally without any medication or other kinds of intervention. So, after my feet were back on the ground, though, I was left with this rather daunting question of how this Jewish boy thought that he was a reincarnation of Buddha and Christ, two people about whom he knew virtually nothing. So I started to read Jung, and that's where I first encountered the idea that Christ, in a way, is an archetype of kind of an idealized self that I had made contact with in this experience. I read Joseph Campbell and learned a lot about the hero's journey, which is, and Joseph Campbell describes it this way, it's an outer metaphor for an inner journey. So that's, I began to see that that's kind of what I had been on, but it still left me with a lot of questions about that. Now, over the next series of years, I worked with a Jungian analyst to help me to understand that experience. I worked at a psychiatric hospital, and that got me very interested in that area, and that's what ultimately led me to go to graduate school in psychology about 4 years later. And in my reading, I had come across a book by Richard Buck. Some of you may have come across this book. It's called Cosmic Consciousness. Many of you may have just heard that term, but it was based on his book, where he starts actually with Buddha, and he traces people, including Christ and Walt Whitman and a number of other people, who had experiences very similar to what I had experienced, who were then able to integrate them and benefit from these experiences. So he used the term cosmic consciousness for that, and actually that's what I began to think of my experience as. However, when I got to graduate school and I took my first class, and this is in '74, or 75, in psychopathology, all of a sudden I learned that what I had had would have been diagnosed in the DSM-2 at that time as an acute schizophrenic reaction. So if I had come to the attention of anybody in the mental health field, I would have been diagnosed with schizophrenia. Presumably I would have been put on antipsychotic medications, hospitalized for the duration of the episode. So at that point, I made a kind of a vow to basically not talk about this. There was no reason to share with anybody. I thought it could jeopardize my career, even my status in graduate school and so on, by ever talking about having gone through this kind of experience. And that may have been an accurate perception of that year. I think things have changed now, but certainly back then that could have definitely put my career in jeopardy. So as part of a psychology graduate program, it's customary, not absolutely mandatory now, but it certainly was what most people did, and that is to work at a psychiatric hospital. So that's how I got out to California. I did an internship at Camarillo State Hospital, which is no longer a state hospital, but now a part of the California college system. But it was a classic state hospital in those days with chronic patients who basically lived there, and in some acute units and so on. So it was there that I started to meet people who were telling me stories that sounded very similar to my own experiences. And I got very interested in how come they were in the hospital and I had managed to make it through that kind of experience and actually felt that I benefited from that. So that's really then what set my career on a path of doing work with, what is a spiritual crisis and how can one identify a spiritual crisis, distinguish it from a mental disorder, and how can one work with those experiences. Now,